Hello, Montana. Hello, world. Chris Islip here from the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. Where do you get your information and news? Is that source reliable? Can that information be used against you? And if so, what can you do about it? These are the questions we're asking this week as we explore information, disinformation, and fake news. This series is brought to you through the generous sponsorship of the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Let me introduce our guest today. Lynn Walsh is an Emmy-award winning freelance journalist who's worked in investigative data and TV journalism at the national and local levels in California, Ohio, Texas, and Florida. Based in San Diego, she is the past president of the Society of Professional Journalists and the assistant director at Trusting News Project, where she's helping to rebuild trust between journalists and the public. Lynn is also an adjunct professor and freelance journalist. She can be reached at lynn@trustingnews.org. Greetings, Lynn. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hello, glad to be here. Thanks so much.
Lynn, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming on. I wonder if you might start by telling our audience a little bit about how journalists are covering this issue of fake news, and maybe give us some tips on how we might recognize it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so to do that, to start, I was just going to share my screen really quickly.
Let me co-host you. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen quickly to walk you through some of what, just a kind of a quick overview of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. And so just first, kind of a quick definition that I think is helpful to start with. Misinformation versus disinformation. Yes, they are different. And disinformation is is a subset of misinformation. But kind of the big difference here is that while both involve false or inaccurate information, the difference is in why it is being shared or produced. So when it comes to misinformation, that is information that might be false or inaccurate that is communicated regardless of an intention to deceive. So people may be sharing it and not knowing that they don't have the intention to deceive. Versus disinformation is specifically created and or shared because it is hoping to deceive people or get them to move their minds in a different direction. So it's all about that intention. When we talk about fake news is also misinformation, but now mostly it's disinformation. So fake news is false or inaccurate information spread by accident or design. It may sometimes look like conspiracy theories, propaganda, hoaxes. Back in the day, a long time ago, they would call it humbug news. That's kind of an old term that some of you may remember or have read about. So why does this matter? This is just a case study from back in the 2016 election, and there was a story where the headline of the story was Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president. And the story was originally published by a site called WTOE 5 News. It was then copied by a fake news publisher called Ending the Feed. So the one thing to point out is there actually are publishers who are producing content specific to deceive, and that is their whole goal. They have created websites, they have social media platforms, and they are designed to look like real news, but instead they are actually trying to push out fake news and disinformation. And so one of those publishers was called Ending the Feed. So they took this story from this website, WTOE 5 News. Now, what's interesting is when you look at WTOE 5 News, you may be thinking, that has a name like a news organization. That may seem credible. Well, it turns out, while the site has since shut down, it was not a news organization. It was not a television station. It was a website. And according to their disclaimer on their website, they were trying to create articles that were satire or pure fantasy. Yet you can see with the title of the news in their URL and on their homepage that looked very much like a news organization, how someone may not see that or understand that. So they create the story again, Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president. Pope Francis then spoke publicly about the US election for the first time and basically said, I never say a word about electoral campaigns. And basically he had to say this because the story got so much traction. And that's why this matters. This information spreads so quickly and people are consuming it and may not even understand that it's being posted to be satire, or people are posting it with intentions to deceive. And you can see that by election day in the US, the story got 960,000 Facebook shares, reactions, and comments. And then after the election, Pope Francis again kind of publicly addressed the dangers of fake news. So that's kind of a little bit about why it matters. Some tips that what should news consumers do. First, you want to consider the source of any information that you're reading. Always look at where is this coming from. If someone's sharing something on social, look to see like, where did they get it from, right? Where are they quoting from? And this just kind of shows a little bit about how news organizations tend to lean. I think it's helpful, but I don't think that's not the only thing that you should do. And this shouldn't be your kind of end all when you're trying to decide if something is fake news or reliable or has a bias in it. The other really important thing to look for is ask yourself if what you are reading or what you are seeing, is it news or is it opinion? The internet and social media have done a great thing in that it has allowed everyone to voice their opinions, and we're getting more diverse voices, and we're hearing from parts of the world that we really maybe never were able to hear from before. I think that's a great thing, but that also means that we have to be better news consumers and take it upon ourselves to think, okay, is this news or is this opinion? And reading opinion is not a bad thing, but I think it's important to know that when you are reading opinion, because then you can make up your mind about, okay, this isn't just facts. Yes, an opinion can contain facts, but it also might only include facts that back up how that person feels or what that person may want you to do when you're voting or going out to buy something, or when it comes to COVID and wearing a mask, right? The other important thing to point out versus news versus opinion content is separate from the newsroom and news decisions. So when you see a news organization say that they are supporting a candidate or endorsing a candidate, that is not the political reporters doing that. That is their opinion team doing that. And those decisions are made completely separate from newsrooms and other political coverage that they may do. Another really important thing to keep in mind is not all opinion content is labeled as opinion, but it still may be opinion. And this is something I think that news organizations have to do a better job. And it's something we're really working with news organizations to do at Trusting News. But sometimes they're still not using the word opinion. So something like that's called a column, an op-ed, a letter to the editor, all of that is considered opinion content. So those are things to be on the lookout for. Some other things, and I'm going to click through these all just so they're on the page at the same time. Make sure you read behind the headline. Don't just read the headline and walk away. What does the entire story say? Checking the date on news content is so important. I've seen people, relatives share stories on Facebook, and the story is a year old. And it gets people kind of riled up again, right? Well, check the date on those stories. There's going to be an updated story related to that subject, but maybe because that headline is pushing an agenda or how certain people feel about the issue, it may be getting circulated again on social media. We talked about consider the source. So you're going to look at the URL. Also check the author and who the journalist is. If you are unfamiliar, Google the person's name. Journalists are going to have public profiles on all of these social media accounts. A lot of them have their own websites, so you can learn more about their background and what they do. The other thing to think about is when you're asking yourself, is it opinion or is this news? Also ask yourself if it's intended as a joke. There are satire organizations out there that are creating content just made to make people laugh. That's okay too, but that doesn't mean that joke then should also be considered news. Some other tips here. You want to make sure you're looking for supporting sources. So when you're reading the story, do they hyperlink to any information where you can dig a little deeper? If they're talking about a lawsuit, do they link to the lawsuit? If they're talking about legislation that's passing, do they link to that legislation so you can read a little bit more about it? Real journalism, ethical journalism, responsible journalists are going to link to that stuff so you can dig a little deeper. See if websites issue corrections or updates for their stories. Something else that I think is super helpful, if you see something being shared by friends and family on social media and you're like, wow, that seems kind of crazy, Google it, search it, and see if anyone else is covering it. If no one else is covering it and the only thing you see popping up is the same website, to me, that's a huge red flag that probably is not something that has been confirmed and or is true. The other thing to think about is checking your biases. So we all, when we consume information, we come into it with our own biases, our own beliefs, our own judgments, maybe about the issue. So sometimes maybe check that and think, am I just upset or thinking this isn't real or believing too much into this because I feel or agree with what it's saying? And I think that's important too, again, to be an informed news consumer. The other thing you can do is you can consult fact-checking websites. You can ask a friend. You also can contact the news organization in your area and say, hey, I've seen people talking about XYZ. I'm really having a hard time deciding if this is true or not. Can you help me with that? And they are there as a resource. And we talked about, distinguishing between objective news and opinion. And this is just helpful. I truly believe that when it comes to the information space that we live in now, journalists have a responsibility to do more here. Social media organizations and companies have a responsibility here. But I also think that we all have a responsibility here as well, and that we shouldn't just be resharing information or liking or continuing to spread information if we haven't read the story, if we haven't done our due diligence to make sure that it is accurate and that it is fair kind of reporting. If we are just sharing things because we think, oh, that's a funny headline, we could be contributing to this misinformation flow and not even know it, which can also be potentially very dangerous as it gains more traction. So just really quick ending here, just what are journalists doing? So journalists are monitoring for this. There are actually some news organizations that have full teams that are looking for misinformation and disinformation claims. They then are researching what they're seeing and in some cases fact checking. Again, there are some news organizations that are completely dedicated to fact checking, and there are some local news organizations that are developing fact checking teams. Especially we saw it around COVID, we will see it around elections. The other thing that journalists are doing is they're asking for help from their users, from their community. So they're asking for your help to monitor what's out there. And if you see something, to alert them so they can look into it. They then are responding to accusations and or to information that's out there that's incorrect. And they're also taking a role in media literacy, which I think is a good thing because I think more journalists need to do that. And so just a couple quick examples of what that looks like. PolitiFact has basically on their website, they always have a way for users to suggest a fact check and something that they want fact checked. It could be a statement. It could be something that you saw on social media. This is something that Wisconsin Watch is doing specifically around the election, and they're just asking people to tell them if they see disinformation or interference of any kind or intimidation efforts related to the election. And I think this is so important to point out because we as journalists can't be everywhere. So our communities can help us kind of be in the places that we are not. And then the last thing is, this is just an example of responding to misinformation accusations. And this is an example of a local newspaper in Milwaukee where they basically had accusations. Their community was accusing them of altering an image, and they responded to, and the accusation from this blogger was kind of going crazy, and people, it was getting more traction than their actual story. So they decided to explain, hey, no, actually, this is what happened. We would never alter a photo. And they showed why people believe or are thinking that it was altered and kind of correcting that misassumption by showing what actually happened. And so I'm going to stop sharing here. Let's see, there we go. And I'm back.
So Lynn, thank you very much for that. I have to say, we're really peeling the onion this week. We've got different perspectives from Jim Ludis on Tuesday, Jake Shapiro yesterday, on how like the history of misinformation, disinformation, a little bit on the tech side, and now you're bringing us the kind of information purveyor or the journalist and media perspective. In your bio, Lynn, and in a few of your slides, You mentioned trust and mistrust, which is really at the basis of this. Nobody's looking at fake news and saying, oh, that's really good fake news, well done. It has an impact of trust and mistrust. And I think that's felt acutely by journalists, because those are the people in our society we look to for a trusted news source that we can rely on. So you mentioned a little bit about what journalists are doing, but could you talk a little bit about, maybe some of the origins of this mistrust? How has it come up, and where is it going?
Yeah, so I think, when you look at traditionally how journalism and journalists and news organizations operated kind of before the internet, it was, you received community members and, everyone received the newspaper maybe at their doorstep. And it was, okay, this is the news. It's being delivered to you. It's kind of a one-way channel. The same goes with local television or any television that you're watching nationally or internationally. Again, they put the news together, they delivered it, that was kind of it. If you wanted to get more information, you were turning to encyclopedias, maybe the internet, but it wasn't as widely accessible to get the information at your fingertips. Now there's so much information in so many different spaces. And I think news organizations didn't do a good enough job in the beginning of distinguishing their content as news and their opinion content as opinion content, and distinguishing themselves from maybe bloggers or stuff that is popping up on YouTube or stuff that's being shared on social. I also don't think that citizens were prepared to know the difference. We weren't educating ourselves well enough to know that. And I think the social media companies also weren't doing enough to make sure that people understood that, hey, you are getting all this information. Again, it's great, but remember, a lot of it's probably opinion. And that's not a bad thing, but it's good to keep in mind when you're consuming the information. It's not just all news, just because someone's has a video and can tell you that and can tell you their feelings or their opinion.
So let me pick up exactly on that, Lynn. I mean, of course, we look at journalists and we look to them to purvey information based on a very clear ethical standard. However, there are a lot of people purveying information, some of whom call themselves journalists, others who do not, some who maintain a standard, others who do not. You've given us some tips on how we can spot those things, but what does it look like from a journalist perspective? Say, what is the journalist perspective on a blogger who's just pounding out information without any fact checking, without any kind of adherence to the ethical standards that journalists adhere to?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think it's the first thing that I want to make sure that people understand is that not all content that you are reading or information that might be journalism is good ethical journalism. And I think that's something that we as journalists don't maybe admit enough, and that we need to recognize that there is information being shared out there and being basically put forward as journalism that is not. And so we as journalists need to do our due diligence to make sure that people know if we are producing that ethical content, how we are doing it, and what that looks like. So talking more about our policies, talking more about why we choose certain stories, being transparent if we get something wrong, not being afraid to talk about it and correct the mistake, and being open to having that conversation of how it can be better and how the mistake happened. So those are kind of things that journalists can do. And I think as a journalist, it can be frustrating because, I do truly believe that having more information out there is a good thing. Again, it has given a voice and an outlet to groups, communities, and areas around the world that we have not heard from before. And I think that's a good thing. But it also means that with more information out there, there's kind of more onus on the consumers to pay closer attention to who those people are, where it's coming from, and what they're doing to vet the information that they're sharing. And I know that takes time and it can be frustrating. And so I think journalists need to do more to try to make that as easy as possible, and make it easier by talking more about how they set themselves apart from maybe the blogger down the street and all of the due diligence that they do.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a kind of distinction to be made between journalism and purveying information via a trusted news source and social media, which is quick and easy and cheap. And I just wanted to amplify a point that you made, which I think is so important, and maybe we miss it, which is you mentioned this idea we should be cautious in how we share and forward social media messages. Dr. Ludis reminded us that surprise and disgust will lead us to be attracted towards fake news, we will share that news, and then an algorithm will notice that it is being shared and will amplify it on its own as an algorithm. So I think a really important point. Lynn, I just want to remind our audience that you're welcome to chat in questions to Lynn on this incredibly fascinating topic and discussion at any time. I will be curating those questions as they come through, so please go right ahead. Now, here's one question that came directly to me, Lynn. I'm not sure if you saw Jake Shapiro's show last night, but he mentioned this idea of having a kind of, if you will, a national weather service for information that comes via social media. That we could, that he is in the process of developing a tech tool, an algorithm that helps us understand what is fake news and what isn't, and that there could be a means through which via tech we could then know, okay, actually what I'm looking at here has a very high probability of being fake news. I mean, any thoughts on an idea like that from the journalist perspective?
Yeah, so there have been tools that I've seen that try to do similar things. There's something called NewsGuard. It is a Chrome extension browser that can be added. And so when you're on a news website, you can basically click on it and it will tell you, give you like a rating to see, okay, is this person, it's kind of almost like a nutritional like label that you would have on food. Like, is this going to be nutritionally good for you in your news diet? Or are there a lot of things that there's a lot of sugar, there's a lot of sodium, whatever it may be, right? And I think things like that can be good to alert members of the public that may not have a lot of time, right, to kind of sort through all of this. There are some concerns that I do have with anytime you build anything that it's an algorithm or it's technology that's going through it. There might be good content that's getting kind of punished or pushed down because maybe they are a newsletter that's just starting, right? And it might be about Indigenous people from a certain area, or it's from a community that's not really well represented, and maybe they don't have a lot of resources to kind of hit all the marks of what that algorithm is looking for. But that doesn't mean that they're not producing ethical, factual content, right? So there is kind of always that concern for me that, does it push out some of that citizen journalism that can be really good, that can alert news organizations to what's happening? Can you always solve that? I don't know. I think some of that is a step in the right direction, but there always are those concerns that I have that you could be then limiting voices and lessening the diversity of what people are seeing, which could be bad.
So Lynn, I mean, the issue of fake news has obviously gained a lot of momentum since 2016. And, for those of us who were watching the presidential debate the other night, again, it comes up, and it comes up more frequently and is more important as we all consider the reliability of our news sources. So I would say that there's a lot at stake here when we talk about fake news. And I wonder if you might share your views from, as a professional journalist. For journalism writ large, what is at stake when we're dealing with fake news?
Yeah, so when you look at kind of research, and I'm not sure if some of your other guests talked about this, but something that people have learned is that misinformation and disinformation thrive in an area where there is an information void. So let's say someone sees something on Facebook and they're like, oh, it might not be true. It might be something that has like a bit of a fact in it, but it's very exaggerated and then goes kind of more to a conspiracy, right? But there's a portion of it that's a fact. And then if they go searching for it and all they find are kind of more things that back that up because it's a YouTuber agreeing with it and sharing their belief, or it's some blogger just kind of, again, doing their opinion in a video or in an Instagram post or whatever it might be. So then that person is more likely to believe that and share it because that's what the information they could find. So as journalists, we look at like, how can you fill that information void so that you fill it with accurate, factual information? And so an example of that is after Brexit, one of the most Googled kind of questions was, what is the European Union? And if you think about how basic that might sound, but it's those basic information voids that, can we anticipate the questions that people might have about these subjects? And can we make sure that they can easily get reliable factual information from credible sources so that instead Because the thing that would happen if we don't do that is that it might be filled with this disinformation and this misinformation. So for journalists, it's a real concern. And I have seen news organizations thinking about this a lot more lately, and how they can, one, be ready to respond more quickly, and two, kind of proactively create content to fill those information voids.
Lynn, thank you so much for that. You really helped us understand this issue from an entirely different perspective, and one that's so critical. Again, I mean, we really look to journalism as the source of reliable and ethical information at a time where we're not exactly sure what is coming our way, but your tips and tools are extremely helpful. Before handing back to you for the last word, I just want to let participants know that this program and all of our programs are recorded and they're up on our YouTube channel. I've chatted in the address for that. So if maybe you missed some of Lynn's slides, I mean, really helpful slides about how to spot fake news and what to do when you do spot it, you can check that out on YouTube later. So Lynn, I want to go back to you. Any last thoughts or ideas for our audience?
Yeah, I think, something that I talk to my parents about, I talk to friends about, we're all in this together. We as consumers can't blame journalists for, maybe us not knowing or getting misled. And I don't think journalists can blame the public for not knowing, news versus misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. And I also think that tech companies are in this as well. So by working together, can we all decide, okay, we're not just going to instantly reshare things, or we're not going to instantly react. We're going to take a closer look at this. We're going to see where the information's coming from. And if we really aren't sure, let's contact journalists and ask them the questions. And then as journalists, let's also understand that that's a lot to ask news consumers to do. So what can we do to make that job easier? And then I think the tech companies need to have those same questions. What can they do to help make it easier on all of us, since that's where a lot of people are getting their information.
Lynn, thank you for that. An excellent way to wrap up, and thanks for your presentation. Also, thanks to all of you who participated today and this week. Again, all of our episodes are up on our YouTube channel. If you like to get information about these programs, you see in the chat box I put our email address. Just let me know. I'll add you to our mailing list. Very happy to do that. We've got several more series coming up in the very near future, including one on international elections and how do international organizations provide support and monitoring to election processes around the world. You won't want to miss that one. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this program, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Thank you all for joining us. I wish you a good day and a good rest of the week. Goodbye.